Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Amy Witherden. With me in the studio, I have Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa to discuss the raging debate over policy in the ruling alliance of the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Thanks for having me again.
Prior to the release of the medium-term budget policy statement last week, there was much talk of a possible economic policy shift. Are any such policy changes discernible?
Well, Amy, I think these expectations of a shift to the left has been in rage since 2007, when the spectre of change in the leadership of the alliance and the leadership of the ANC was on the brink. There were all these assumptions that were being made that there will be a shift. And then when the events occurred in 2007 and Thabo Mbeki was removed as from a leader of the African National Congress but remained as leader of the government, there were expectations that when Mbeki would vacate the presidency, then would be the decisive moment at which there would be a shift. When he was recalled earlier than expected, people thought that will be the cataclysmic moment at which this mythical shift and sudden change and about turn in policy was going to occur. Of course, in all of those three instances, it didn't materialize. And then the expectation was that let the 2009 election come, and then, of course, we'll see the real beginnings of the shift occurring. It really didn't fundamentally occur. Then we had the inception of a new cabinet, a new dispensation in government, a new administrative structure. They put in place a monitoring and evaluation unit in the presidency, and more importantly created the Planning Commission. And of course, once the Planning Commission was announced, then there was this woeful noise about the fact that this Planning Commission would act as some centralizing, coordinating and centralizing unit which was going to then lay down the law, and we haven't seen that materialize. So clearly expectations before the announcement of the medium-term budget policy statement comes on the back of 5 or 6 sort of historical moments at which people assumed that there would be the shift to the left. Now, in truth, I think since the inception of Jacob Zuma's presidency and the ANC winning the 2009 elections, there has been some discernible shifts, and that is not, you cannot deny it. It's undeniable in the sense that there's been a restructuring in government, number one. Number two, there's been the inception of the monitoring unit, as I've just mentioned, and the Planning Commission. No doubt, this also coincided with the worst bits and effects of the global economic crisis. So when we put all of that together, we find that you had a government which had to make a shift, perhaps not conceptually in policy terms, but no doubt in terms of emphasis in the broader policy terrain. And I think what the ANC has done as a political party through its manifesto is got the new ANC government, so that means the South African government constituted of the ANC as the ruling party and its alliance partners, take that policy, that manifesto of an election campaign, and transfer that into the medium-term framework for government's program of action. And in that respect, of course, the priorities remained health, education, rural development, crime and policing, and the reduction of crime, and of course increasing in policing. Those were the priorities identified in the manifesto, and that, I think, are the priorities identified in the medium-term budget policy statement. So if the expectations of the political shifts conceptually had come to pass in the manner that people assumed, then of course they didn't in the ANC's manifesto, and there's no reason therefore logically why it would appear in the medium-term budget policy statement, because clearly it didn't happen in its manifesto. And if the manifesto had become the program of action for government, then automatically that program of action would have to define and decide in broad terms what the content of the medium-term budget policy statement would be. So clearly the logical fallacy, just on a logical basis, doesn't follow through. So the expectation was again a red herring. The evidence clearly also points in that regard, and I've just pointed out in 5 instances in which this expectation was mooted, which did not in fact come to pass. And of course the evidence is more abundantly cleared in the medium-term budgetary policy statement itself, in the sense that the priority areas identified by the African National Congress in its manifesto are of course the priority areas identified in the policy statement. But indeed it adds the dimensions of economic policy, and that's where people expected the shift might occur. But let's look at the terms of what's been announced in the medium-term budget policy statement and see whether they actually conform to this idea of what people assume to be left. And of course when they make this assumption, they don't spell out what the indicators are going to be for this leftward shift, or this mythical shift to the left. And so the medium-term budget policy statement identifies, of course, saving jobs, increasing infrastructure spend, particularly reskilling workers who may be laid off, and all of this in the context of declining revenues through taxation, yet increased public expenditure and the demands on government in terms of meeting many of its programs. And of course bolstered in this is the commitments to service delivery, the reform of the health system, making plans for the inception of the National Health Service and the National Health Insurance. So clearly the reflection of the priority areas are clearly the development indicators which South Africa is mostly in need of finding expansion on, and improvements in quality. And so if that for most people constitutes left, then of course it is left. But as a value judgment, it is not necessarily a bad shift to the left, even if it is a shift to the left or it isn't. These clearly are in conformity to the kind of development expectations that South Africans have, and that the South African government in terms of its own priority programs has identified. So I think ultimately this expectation that there is going to be the shift to the left is indeed and in fact a red herring. If people assume in political terms that because you have the National Planning Commission and this monitoring mechanism which has been put in place, then those are indicators of a centrally planned economy, of a commandist type of decision making, then it clearly seems to be working for the better, because what has been the outcomes of this? On the basis of the evidence, what this has given rise to is the fact that in local government and that department responsible for local government, on the back of many of the social protests, have now incepted an audit of what's going on in local governments. They've had a national indaba in which they've identified priority areas which they would wish to tackle in terms of service delivery at the local level, but also reduce levels of corruption, increase levels of local politicians' accountability, and make sure that there's a degree of responsiveness and fit between what government expects local councillors and local officials at the local government level to do, and how they would then respond to the communities who demand that. So clearly this kind of audit, this kind of monitoring mechanism, this kind of evaluation is necessary, and there's nothing commandist about this. What it does in fact spell out is that this kind of monitoring and evaluation mechanism is a necessary one, because it needs to fix many of the pitfalls which have happened at local government level. Then if we look at the second outcome and outgrowth of this, is that there will be an audit of the quality of housing and housing provision, because clearly that's one of the other areas in which there's been many problems. So the idea that these audits, this planning commission, the monitoring mechanism is a political instrument of control, of centralization, and of some kind of commandist approach to the way in which society is going to be managed is clearly fallacious, equally fallacious as it is in the economic front, where the assumptions about this conceptual leftward shift and lurch in the economic sense also didn't come to pass. So I think on both counts they seem to be red herrings. But let's then really look, I suppose, at what the outcomes and what the challenges will be for government in trying to incept both the kind of medium-term policy statement that they've set out in the budget policy statement, and the emphasis it wishes to lay in the different areas, in the economy, saving jobs, on trying to address the financial crisis. And just a word on the financial crisis, obviously South Africa is going to feel this, and we do feel it. You've had claimants on the unemployment insurance fund doubling in about 8 months. You've had about close to 1 million job losses over the last year. the ability for government to have to bail out companies through either public investment or reskilling workers is going to come at fairly high cost, and all of this happens in the declining arena of the ability to raise revenue, and yet the demands for expenditures go up and are high. But the reality is that South Africa has faced very high unemployment levels for close on to 15 years and more. But we're just talking in the period since the transition in 1994. So clearly what the financial crisis does is it doesn't introduce many of these problems into South Africa, it simply exacerbates them. So the policy problems have been with us for the past 15 years. The magnitude, of course, may have undoubtedly shifted and therefore require a different response. The second is that it's not just unemployment levels, it's also the levels of poverty and the levels of increasing inequality, which we've had way before the financial crisis hit. So the idea that our deepening levels of poverty and the increasing levels of social inequality, whether they be income inequality or the power of people and citizens to come together to associate and make demands on the state or on private companies, etc., has been hampered by the financial crisis, is again another misnomer, simply because it is not the financial crisis that introduces this kind of social polarities into South Africa, it simply exacerbates them. So clearly our policy trajectory has had to remain on course if we wanted to reach some of the development outcomes from way back and from before the financial crisis. So it's not surprising that we didn't follow exactly the same route in addressing the financial crisis that many of the other developed economies did. Because in those economies, clearly you had the state bailing out banks. So it was almost a case of use a socialist measure to actually save capitalism. And in that case, you know, we didn't hear people saying, well, you know, there's a sudden shift in the left to Europe, in Europe and in the US.
It was necessary.
It was simply a necessary condition. And the same is true in South Africa. Now, South Africa has not reached the stage where the state has had to bail out banks. But what the state is having to do, and the medium-term budget policy statement lays this out, is lay out expenditures which are going to be added burdens beyond the trajectory which was decided more than 5 years ago, to have to reskill workers, to try and ensure that there's some kind of public investment to save companies and that they don't always close down, to stimulate manufacturing, to invest in infrastructure, and very importantly, to stimulate the kind of industrial policies we need. One of the gaps, I think, in economic policy planning, even though we now have the Planning Commission, is the kind of policies that we will use to stimulate industrial policy, because those are now going to become micro-level interventions which government is going to have to define. And I suspect we will find the spectre of the idea of a lurch to the left emerging when these micro details have to be spelled out about how industrial capacity and industrial strategy is going to be stimulated. And there I suspect there will be another expectation that we will have large amount of grants, large amount of tax subsidies, large amounts of tax cuts for these companies or for manufacturing in some of those industrial sectors. And I don't suspect that that will in fact happen. What might happen is you might have subsidies and grants being given, but that's simply to stimulate productive activity in those areas. And the final word I would say on the question of whether there's a leftward or rightward shift is that what the medium-term budget policy statement does is that it relaxes exchange controls for about, you know, the third time running. And that clearly is not a left measure. Of course, government would argue that this is simply to ensure that, you know, the counter effects of cyclical movements in the currency, in money supply and so forth is not affected. And that because we are importing a lot more capital equipment for a lot of inputs in our economy, we have to allow that people can actually take out money to go and buy and acquire the stuff without adversely affecting the kind of money supply that is remaining in South Africa. But as a measure, conceptually, the idea that you relax exchange controls is not a very leftist one. So clearly all the indications are that there is no such mythical leftward shift, and I think it's been both a political red herring and an economic red herring.